hatred, which could destroy so much, never failed to destroy the man who hated. That quote from James Baldwin is what he called an immutable law. Good evening, I'm Joy Reid. Donald Trump is in what can only be described as a full meltdown, as polls show support for his re-election is cratering across the country. New polling from the New York Times shows Trump losing to Joe Biden by significant margins in a half dozen swing states. Biden is up by 11 points in Michigan and Wisconsin, up by 10 in Pennsylvania and 6 in Florida. Nobody is ever up by 6 in Florida. Even in Arizona, a traditionally red state, Biden leads by 7 points. And he's ahead by a stunning 9 points in North Carolina, a state that he and Barack Obama won when Obama was elected as America's first black president in 2008. Those dismal numbers for his re-election likely reflect the degree to which Trump is mismanaging the response to 3 simultaneous national crises: the outcry over racial injustice, the continued spread of the coronavirus, and the ongoing economic decline triggered by the pandemic.
New numbers out this morning. President Trump trailing Joe Biden by sizable margins among registered voters in 6 battleground states that Trump won in 2016. According to the latest New York Times Siena College poll out this morning, Biden is up 11 points in Michigan, 47%, to Trump's 36%. Biden is also up 11 points in, wait for it, Wisconsin, 49 to 38. The latest Marquette Law School poll also has Biden up in that state by 8 points in that poll. Back to the New York Times Siena numbers, Biden has a 10-point advantage in Pennsylvania, 50 to 40. Trump carried Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by less than a point. Biden is up 6 points in Florida, 47 to 41. Biden's lead by 7 points is in Arizona as well, 48 to 41. And the former vice president is up 9 points in North Carolina, 49 to 40%. Willie, it kind of explains the congressional races in North Carolina. Biden's doing well there. He's doing well in a lot of states that Trump won.
Oh, sorry, is that me? Yeah, I mean, you've looked through these states. We've focused on these national polls that have shown 14-point spreads, 12-point spreads, 10-point spreads, and those have been interesting for their crosstabs in how poorly the president is doing among women, among independents. You can tick through all those specific groups, but the polls that matter are the ones that you just tick through. And Sam Stein, if we go through, again, as Mika said, these are 6 states that President Trump won. He won many of them by extraordinarily narrow margins. It's the famous 77 votes across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Michigan, in particular, has to be of concern. That's a place where he won by only 10,000 votes. Wisconsin, he won in 2016 by 23,000 votes. Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes. He didn't have a margin for error to begin with, and these states now are starting to get away from him.
Yeah, and like Joe, I don't think it's particularly complex to explain this all. I mean, people look at the tweets and the rhetoric and they point to that, but really in the end, he's in the eyes of a lot of voters, he's failed at 2 very important dual governing crises. One is the medical crisis around coronavirus, and the second is handling the protests that have emanated from the George Floyd killing. Both of them have been objectively botched, if you at least judge the polls here. And so, you know, the question for Trump people now is how do you turn this around? You know, what can you do at this juncture to actually recoup some of the lost ground here? And honestly, they're doing exactly the wrong thing. They're completely doubling down on their rhetoric, dismissing the COVID cases. And Mike Pence last week was talking about no need to worry about a second wave. Well, we're still in the first wave. And that gives this aura that they're dismissing a crisis that people are feeling very tangibly in these critical states. I will say there's an even more ominous sign right underneath the surface of these polls, which is Trump actually still holds a fairly decent standing on the economy. I think they tested how voters feel about each candidate on the economy, and Trump did fairly well there. There's been a boatload of economic assistance that Congress passed in the early spring to deal with the COVID crisis that is going to run out fairly soon. And if Congress does not extend that unemployment benefits, federal assistance for businesses and like, we could be dealing with a much bigger economic catastrophe than we already have, at which point Trump's one read of hope could potentially vanish even further. So, while this does seem like the nadir for him in these polls, it could actually get worse.
Joe, I'll save you our daily caveat that it's 4.5 months till the election. Everything could change, as the last 4.5 months have taught us. So we'll look at these polls, and they're interesting today. But Joe, we've talked a lot about on this show over the last few months how the president has been out of step with the country. First on coronavirus, then on the protests and the movement in the streets. And again now, as we see these spikes in Florida, we see these big spikes in California and Texas. The federal government under the Trump administration is pulling back funding for some testing sites. You had Vice President Pence calling around, talking to Republican senators yesterday, assuring them that they shouldn't worry about the numbers, that yes, the cases are up, but mortality is down. They're trying to spin their way out of a public health crisis. You can't do that.
I mean, the first thing is that this is an interesting sort of way of getting confirmation. We've had national poll numbers, as you mentioned, for the last couple of weeks that have looked really bad for the president. And you start to wonder, well, is it possible they're missing something? Are these outliers, anything? When you start getting state polls that match the national polls, that's sort of confirmation that we really are right now, at least in the situation you're describing. I mean, the way I look at it is we had moments in 2016 where Donald Trump sort of hit ebbs, where the the gap that he faced against Hillary Clinton would get extra large, and it would, about a week or two later, it would kind of return to baseline. There is a question here of whether Trump is in one of those ebbs right now, although I would note this ebb would be worse for him than any of the ebbs he had in 2016. When you start looking at gaps like this in these states, when you start looking at polls that show him down 11, 12, 13, 14 points nationally, he would be behind Hillary Clinton in 2016, but he wouldn't be quite that far behind Hillary Clinton. It seems in this in these Battleground state polls from the New York Times and Siena, the biggest shift that you're seeing here, it is among white voters. White voters, about 2/3, about 70% of the electorate in November. This is a group that Donald Trump won by 20 points in 2016. In this polling right now in these states, it's down to 4 points. That's the advantage he has. Wow. There's been a margin here among white voters with a college. White voters kind of split in half, with a college degree, without a college degree. It's two groups we've seen that are kind of diverging politically in the last number of years, and especially in the Trump era. Here's a Biden lead in these states, cumulatively in this New York Times poll, a Biden lead of 21 points among white voters with a college degree. Again, this used to be, if you go back just a generation, really, a bedrock Republican constituency. Voters in the suburbs, white voters in the suburbs, have been moving steadily towards the Democrats. But in the Trump era, this is exploding. And you see it here with Joe Biden now opening up an enormous advantage there. And the other one that jumps out to me, we had talked about this a few months ago. If you go back pre-coronavirus, when the polling between Biden and Trump was a little more competitive, was a little closer, one of the weaknesses that Biden had was that he didn't have the kind of advantage among younger voters that you would normally expect, I think, given expect sort of younger voters to be on the Democratic side, given everything we hear and we've seen. It was a 17-point advantage for Biden in this polling among 8 voters last fall. It's now nearly 40 points. So it's now moved much more in line, I think, with what expectations were. It was an area where Biden was lagging. It may be an effect of the protests over the last few weeks, the attention to racial justice issues, but more than a doubling of Biden's advantage among 18 to 29-year-old voters. That's a place where there was slack for Biden a while back, and you're just not seeing it now.
Mike Barnicle, I know you have a question for Steve Kornacki, but can't help but talk to you about a trend that you and I both know and have both seen in our adult lifetimes. That it was Ronald Reagan who made the suburbs solidly Republican, and certainly did that in 1980, 84, 88. And it remained that way. The suburbs remained solidly Republican, especially the white suburbs remained solidly Republican, as Steve Kornacki said, until recently. And what Ronald Reagan built in the suburbs, Donald Trump has destroyed. And we don't have to look at these numbers that we've gotten from the New York Times Siena poll this morning. We can just look at the election results from 2017, 2018, 2019. The Reagan coalition has been blown to bits by Donald Trump. And right now, these numbers suggest, if we continue in this direction, we will see it in the most dramatic way come November.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's pretty easy to understand why, Joe. If you reflect back in 1980 and 1984 and Ronald Reagan running for president, running for re-election as a president, he didn't scare anybody. He didn't go out there with race-baiting language. He didn't behave like a social arsonist every time he left the White House or he went on the campaign trail. Those two items are something that Donald Trump has done each time he has been out in the past 2 or 3 weeks. He did it in Tulsa and he did it in Arizona. Race-baiting and social arson, pouring gasoline on open wounds. And it is incredible that we have more than 40 million people collecting unemployment benefits in this country, and that issue alone is overshadowed by two paramount issues today, the virus and race in America. And Steve, I'd like you, if you could, address the underlying elements in the poll when it comes to women in the suburbs, college-educated women, and non-college educated women. Where are they? Where do you sense they're going?
Yeah, I mean, this is if you looked at the national poll that the New York Times and CNN put out yesterday. Today they've got these 6 battleground state polls. The national poll yesterday had Trump down 14 points nationally to Joe Biden, 50 to 36. In that poll, white women with a college degree, college-educated white women, were with Joe Biden by nearly 40 points. So that is, again, we've talked about, this has been a story that was told before Donald Trump, that, hey, you sort of had these non-college white voters were trending a little bit towards the Republicans, college-educated white voters more towards the Democrats. There was some foundation for that before Trump, but what's happened is Trump came along in 2016, got elected, the last 3 years have gone as they have, and that divergence has just become just a massive, massive chasm now, where you've got, like, Trump still doing well, relatively speaking, with non-college white men, and then you go to the other end, college-educated white women, you've got a 40-point gap. Just a huge, huge divergence has opened up there.
Hey, Steve, Sam here. Less of an empirical question, more of a philosophical one, but I'm curious to your take nonetheless. I have a theory about presidential elections, which is that they tend to be reactive events. And by that, I mean Bush obviously was going to follow Clinton because he was preaching, morals in the White House. And Obama was going to follow Bush because he was preaching post-partisanship. And Trump, for obvious reasons, is a reactive event to Obama. To that degree, does Biden, being this sort of guy who's non-dramatic, not in your face, a return to your norms, staying in his basement, as Joe said, but sort of not offending people as a matter of course, does that help him here in that he's creating a really obvious contrast to the showmanship, the in-your-face elements of the Trump presidency?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. And that's what Willie was talking about a few minutes ago. I think he was exactly right. It's just the idea that Biden has almost ceded the stage here willingly to Donald Trump and let Donald Trump be the star of the last few months and let people sort of make up their mind based on that. And I look at these poll numbers right now, and one question I ask myself is, did it have to be this way? If the Democrats had nominated anybody else, would it also be this way? Would Bernie Sanders, would Elizabeth Warren also be 14 points up? And I don't know what kind of campaign they would have run, but I wonder, we talk about the strength that Biden has right now among suburban voters, suburban whites who had voted Republican in the past. And I wonder if Bernie Sanders, if he would still be leaning in, we probably likely would, be still leaning in on the sort of democratic socialist message. Would that be putting those gains that Democrats have made in the suburbs, would that be putting those at risk to some extent? Yes. I wonder, if Elizabeth Warren, or I just wonder, if she leaned in or another candidate got forward and leaned in more in a more aggressive fashion on these protests. And I wonder, Biden has put this election in a position, has put this campaign, I think, in a position where, like Willie is saying, Trump is the featured player right now, and people are basing their judgments, I think, based on their assessment of Trump, and that's it right now.
So, Yamiche, I'm just wondering how the president's advisors in the White House are feeling about the president's decisions. Let's just focus on Corona, pulling back federal funding on testing, having events. I mean, these are
super spreader
events. These are events and decisions that go against the science and endanger the American people. And I guess I could also filter your question down to the Trump campaign, which could be like making T-shirts saying Trump 2020, he's killing us. I mean, his decisions are not helping the American people stay alive during a pandemic. He's actually adding to the problem. What are his advisors saying? Are they frustrated? Are they with him on all of this?
Well, the White House and the Trump campaign are largely circling the wagons around President Trump because President Trump has really decided to posit himself as anti-mask, anti-pandemic. And by anti-pandemic, I mean wanting to put the pandemic in the rearview mirror and really barreling forward through November. So I think what you have is a president who is on defense. He's on his heels. He feels that. And that's why you see him today going to Wisconsin to have a town hall with his favorite network, Fox News. You see him also going to speak to what will likely be a large crowd of Trump supporters in Wisconsin. But in reality, the president can't run away from the idea that there is federal funding being pulled from some sites. Now, yesterday, White House officials held a call that said, well, actually, these 13 sites that are going to now lose federal funding, they're going to just be transitioned to state funding and transition to the idea that states will control them. They said that that's the best way to do it, to streamline things. But then quickly after that, you had people like Senator Cornyn, who is a pretty reliable Republican ally of the president, as well as health officials come out and say, look, in a place like Texas that is now seeing more virus, we don't need to be changing things up. We don't need to be pulling federal resources. In fact, we need more federal resources. So what you have is as the White House is kind of justifying the president's stance here, because it is really his stance that he's deciding. You have health officials and Republicans saying this is not going to be good, not only for the country, but also for November.
You know, Willie, we've seen such colossal stupidity on the part of not just politicians that blindly follow Donald Trump, but people online who blindly follow those would save lives. We've heard that from scientists,
Wouldn't
from
want
doctors,
to do that, apparently.
He moved on about 2.5 months ago. He wanted this to end Easter. He was going to turn the page back in Easter in the middle of April. We're now into late June, and we're seeing, just as this was predicted by Drs. Fauci and Birx and others, the way this would play out. It would be suppressed in New York and those hot spots on the East Coast and come back in other places. And Mika, now here we are, exactly where the doctors told us we would be. And President Trump, in this moment, when we're seeing a record day in this country yesterday of cases, pulling federal funding for testing sites, including 7 in the state of Texas, where the biggest spike is happening right now.
So he wasn't kidding. He does want to pull back on testing. It's not going to fund it. I mean, he's never kidding. I think that's something we're finally learning about this presidency.
Every day we get more polling evidence to suggest that if the presidential election were held right now, and it's not going to be, it's going to be some months and things can happen, but if it were held now, Trump would not just lose to Joe Biden, he would lose badly. He would get drubbed. New Battleground state polling released today by the New York Times and Siena College shows Biden with a 9-point advantage across 6 key battleground states. If Biden wins those states and all the states Clinton won, he would at least 333 electoral votes. Here to walk us through the results, the guy who oversaw that polling, Nate Cohn, domestic correspondent for The Upshot at the New York Times. So, Nate, let's start with sort of the general characterization of the state of the race right now based on your national and battleground state polling.
Not terribly close, Chris. We found the president trailing by 14 points nationwide, losing by 9 points across the battleground states, as you said. That kind of margin also implies that he's probably trailing in the whole next tier of swing states, or at least in a highly competitive race, including Georgia or Texas, Ohio, Iowa. That would certainly endanger the Republican hold of the Senate, and Biden would be in position to win as many as 400 electoral votes.
What's driving this right now in the internals, both in terms of, you know, what issues and what sort of subgroups demographically is leading to this result? Right.
So just starting with the issues, I think it's very simple. In the last couple of months, American life has been shaken by new issues that didn't exist 6 months ago, the coronavirus pandemic, and the whole spate of issues surrounding racial justice in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, including these protests and the president's handling them. And on these issues, voters have concluded that they think the president has largely failed. And as a result, they have swung against the president in a sweeping manner. And it is difficult to answer your second question, Chris, about where his weakness is most pronounced. I mean, it's everywhere. If I were to narrow it down, I guess I'd say it's most obvious among white voters. The president has lost almost the entirety of his advantage among white voters in battleground states. And that's even though these voters say they backed the president by a 2.5-point margin across the 6 states here. It's a broad loss among white voters. It's among young voters. It's among older voters. It's among college-educated voters. It's among those without a degree. It's in the cities and the suburbs and in the countryside.
One thing that's interesting when you think about the Electoral College math is that you're looking at the 3 states that sort of put him over, which is the Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, running the table in those 3 states. You guys have him down double digits in all of those. But then, as you said, you start to think about where the electoral sort of battleground is. You expand out to places like Florida or North Carolina, where you have Biden winning by wide margins. Those were states that Barack Obama carried in 2008. And then you go to states like Iowa or Ohio, which seemed really far past the reaches of what a Democrat could win just because of the demographic changes and polarization of the country. And if you look at like the 538 polling average, you've got, those look like they're close too.
That's right. And, I'd note that Iowa and Ohio aren't just states that seem like they were going the opposite direction of the country, but Iowa voted for Donald Trump by 10 percentage points in 2016. Yeah. And the idea that that state would be really competitive seems a surprise at first. But, Wisconsin voted for the president by a point last time, and so did Pennsylvania and Michigan. So if Joe Biden's up 10 points in the traditional Midwestern battleground states, then why shouldn't it be a tied race in Iowa, where he did win by 10 points last time? In all of these cases, we're just talking about a broad, across-the-board 10-point shift in the president's direction among white voters, and that's what all these states are about. Or rather, in Joe Biden's direction.
The last frontier then are 3 states that Democrats have not won in a long time, and Barack Obama didn't win. That's Arizona, Georgia, and Texas. And Arizona, particularly of the 3 of those, Arizona almost, I think at this point, you have to start to say that at this point in Arizona, that Joe Biden's favored to win there at this point. Would you say that?
I don't see how you could reach a different conclusion at this point, frankly. The president has been weak in the Arizona polling from the start. He didn't get 50% of the vote in 2016. The Democratic numbers on party registration have been steadily closing there. And we know that the president is struggling to win Republicans there. So, at the moment, it would take a pretty significant shift in the race for him even to be considered a 50-50 proposition.
In fact, the Department of Labor announced today that 1.5 million Americans filed for unemployment just last week. Furthermore, the International Monetary Fund says the U.S. GDP will plummet 8% this year, far more than its earlier estimate. Meanwhile, after defying health recommendations on social distancing in coronavirus hotspots like Phoenix and Tulsa, Trump continues to show his complete disregard for public safety, even for the lives of his own devoted followers. As we speak, Republicans are trying to deliver on the full arena that Donald Trump is demanding for his convention. According to Politico, they feel additional pressure to ensure the president is pleased with his turnout after the small crowds at Trump's Tulsa rally. In contrast, the Democratic National Committee yesterday announced that they're planning a nearly all virtual convention this August. This comes as the Washington Post reports that dozens of Secret Service officers who attended Trump's Tulsa rally were ordered to self-isolate after possible exposure to the virus.
Face coverings have become a polarizing or political issue. How can we get past that?
There's no secret formula for that except to say, get past it. It should not be a political issue. It is purely a public health issue.
I mean, we haven't beat it. Everything people are doing, they're going to have to say, just wear a mask. Are you social distancing? So I hope everybody takes it seriously, because we haven't beaten this. We don't have a vaccine yet. Hopefully we'll have it at the end of the year. We do. It seems like the doctors have done a really good job trying to figure out how to keep people alive and recover. But, we're not where we need to be.
I mean, everyone should just wear a mask. Like you guys are, like I am right now. It's a virus. It's a respiratory virus that spreads from person to person. And the more people you come in contact with in an unprotected setting, the likelier you are to be infected by it. But this is going to be our challenge moving forward until we have a vaccine. I mean, but we can't shut down the economy again. So I just hope everybody does the best they can to protect themselves. And we know how. We've been told repeatedly how to do it. Just do it.
Those are Florida Senators Rick Scott and Marco Rubio agreeing with, wait for it, Dr. Fauci.
Science.
I would guess also, and I'm grateful, I am very grateful that they came out and said what they said, for the deniers who are still out there, the deniers that went to Palm Beach County. You've seen the videos talking about witches and warlocks and devils and conspiracy theories spread, of course, on Facebook, that masks are of the devil and get in the way with God's breathing. So no, we are actually temples that God has created. It protects the temple from collapse. That's another way to look at it. And by the way, Marco Rubio and Rick Scott and some other Republicans who can no longer look at these super spreader events that Donald Trump is forcing people to put in place in Arizona,
in Tulsa, in any area that will kill senior citizens. Arizona's senior citizens, their lives just got a lot more complicated after the super spreader event that Donald Trump pushed in Arizona. So he could do what? So he could spread conspiracy theories about American democracy. And so he could say racist ramblings meant to inspire his 35%. And of course, all of this comes with the President of the United States and his allies on Facebook, his allies on talk radio, his allies on cable news, continuing to downplay the dangerousness of this virus, like Larry Kudlow. And of course, Kellyanne Conway back in March saying that the virus was contained. Oh, yeah. It's done.
And then 120,000 Americans died, and now Kudlow is once again saying that it's under control. Donald Trump not wearing a mask, going to factories in Maine who are ramping up as quickly as they can on testing supplies and not wearing a mask and making those people destroy. Making those people destroy everything that they were producing while he was there, because the President of the United States wouldn't wear a mask. And here is the catch, and it's what we've been saying every day, and everything's on tape. So go back and look at it from the beginning of this, from the beginning of this crisis. When the president was denying this, we were saying, just follow the science. Just follow the doctors. Just do what the doctors tell you to do. It's what Joe Biden was saying at the end of January. And yet the president still won't do that. The president's still saying this is going to magically go away. The president's still refusing to tell his supporters that go to his super spreader events that people will look back on 20 years from now in horror. In horror. The president's still saying he's not wearing a mask. And by the way, all of this comes on a day when the United States hit a new record for daily coronavirus cases 2 months after the previous record. And months after the president said it was just one person coming in and it was going to go away. It's 15 people coming in. It's going to go away. It's telling African-American leaders it was going to magically go away. It hasn't gone away. And I just want, we're going to show you some polls from swing states. And we could give a lot of grand explanations for why those numbers are as low as they are. We could get political scientists from around the globe, the greatest minds, to come in and dissect the crosstabs and tell you why Donald Trump is losing so badly nationally and in every swing state. But we don't have to do that. Well, hell, I told you that. I told the president this on the show every day back in March. Would you? It's going to be like Romp Room. I can look in and put up my. We can talk about it. But would you like to sing along with me? Here we go. Here it is.
No.
This is a medical crisis. No. All right? When you take care of the medical crisis, then the business crisis will be taken care of. And when the business crisis is taken care of, your political crisis will be taken care of. Said it repeatedly. It hasn't been taken care of, Mika. Mm-hmm. He cannot bring himself to follow science, to save the lives of senior citizens, and just let his doctors lead. And because of that, his support continues to drop to historic lows for any incumbent running for re-election.
You just got to wonder if he really wants to win.
Testing unequivocally saves lives, and widespread testing is the key to opening our economy again. That's one edge of the sword. The other edge is that he thinks that finding out that more Americans are sick will make him look bad. That's what he's worried about. He's worried about looking bad. Well, Donald Trump needs to stop caring about how he looks and start caring about what America's happening to the rest of America.